Long before borders crossed the Eurasian steppe, the Scythians moved through a landscape that seemed endless. Their homes were rarely built to last, yet traces of their world still remain, hidden in burial mounds, scattered foundations, and quiet patterns across the grasslands. Here on Made for Sleep, we slow history down and let these quieter stories unfold. Tonight, we'll wander through the lost architecture of the Scythian Nomads and the vanished empire that once drifted across the steppe. Let the fire crackle softly beside you, and if you feel like it, tell me how you're doing in the comments and what time it is where you're listening from. The vast grasslands stretching from the Black Sea to the borders of China once belonged to people who built no cities and left no stone monuments. Between roughly 800 BCE and 300 CE, the Scythians created an empire of movement across the Eurasian steppe, their entire civilization designed to travel with the seasons. What remains of their world lies mostly underground, preserved in frozen tombs that archaeology is only beginning to understand. You're watching the grass move, not in the gentle, predictable way grass sways near a garden or park, but in vast coordinated waves that ripple across distances too enormous for your eyes to fully comprehend. The steppe spreads before you like an ocean frozen mid-swell, and the grass, feather grass mostly, with its silvery seed heads catching the late afternoon light, bends and rises in patterns that suggest the wind itself is a kind of invisible architecture. This is the Pontic Caspian steppe, sometime around 700 BCE, and you're learning that emptiness can be surprisingly full. What appears at first glance to be nothing but endless grassland reveals itself, upon longer observation, to be a landscape of subtle variations. There's the darker green where water collects in shallow depressions, the lighter patches where last year's fire cleared the ground, the barely perceptible rise and fall of the land that determines where you can see for miles and where the horizon suddenly drops away into hidden valleys. The temperature sits somewhere in that pleasant range between warm and cool, the kind of day where you could comfortably wear either a light coat or go without. The air smells like dried grass and distance, with occasional notes of wild sage when the wind shifts direction. If you stay very still, you can hear the grass itself making small rustling sounds, thousands of stalks rubbing against each other in a whisper that never quite stops. You're not alone, though you might feel that way for the first few minutes. The feeling of solitude on the steppe can be overwhelming, even when you're surrounded by people. The scale does something strange to human presence, making even a crowd seem scattered and small. But there are others here. You just have to adjust your expectations of what here means. About half a mile to your east, though distance on the steppe becomes oddly theoretical, playing tricks with your perception, you can make out movement that resolves itself, after some squinting, into people and animals. Horses mostly, and the low rounded shapes of what you'll eventually recognise as dwellings, though they look less like houses and more like features of the landscape that happen to be temporary. These are Scythians, or at least that's what the Greeks will eventually call them, a catch-all term for the various nomadic peoples who will dominate these grasslands for the better part of a millennium. The Scythians themselves have different names for their various groups and clans, names that shift and recombine as alliances form and dissolve, as families merge and separate, as the endless movement of their lives creates new configurations of identity. You start walking toward the distant camp, and immediately discover that walking on the steppe is more complicated than it looks. The ground seems level until you're actually on it, at which point you realise it's full of small irregularities, tufts of grass, shallow dips, the occasional animal burrow. Your ankle turns slightly on uneven ground, and you adjust your gait, developing a kind of rolling walk that absorbs the constant minor variations in the terrain. The grass comes up past your knees in most places, occasionally waist-high in spots where the growing conditions were particularly favourable. Walking through it makes a continuous swishing sound, and you leave a temporary trail of bent stalks that slowly springs back upright behind you. Small grasshoppers launch themselves away from your feet in sporadic arcs, their wings making brief clicking sounds. A bird you don't recognise, something vaguely lark-like, takes off from almost directly under your feet, scaring you badly enough that you actually yelp a little. The bird doesn't care. It spirals upward into the enormous sky, singing a complicated, trilling song that somehow doesn't get lost in all that space. The sky deserves its own paragraph, really. It's not just big. You've seen big skies before, but present in a way that makes it feel like an active participant in the landscape, rather than just background. Clouds move across it in stately procession, their shadows racing ahead of them across the grass, creating moving patches of darker green that flow like water. The blue has a particular quality you've never quite seen elsewhere, deep and somehow three-dimensional, as if the atmosphere itself is a visible substance. As you get closer to the camp, details begin to resolve. The rounded dwellings you saw from a distance turn out to be felt structures stretched over wooden frames, somewhere between a tent and a building. They're surprisingly large, some of them easily 20 feet in diameter, and decorated with geometric patterns that probably have meanings you don't yet understand. These are called kibetkas, or felt houses, though you won't learn that term for a while yet. What you notice first is how perfectly suited they seem to this landscape, how they echo the gentle swells of the terrain, how their rounded tops shed wind the way the hills do. There's no fighting against the environment here, no assertion of straight lines and rigid angles against the curved world of grass and sky. The dwellings accept the wind, accommodate the rain, exist in cooperation with the weather rather than in opposition to it. Horses graze nearby, lots of them, scattered across the grassland in loose groups. These aren't the massive, placid draft animals you might be familiar with from later agricultural societies. These are smaller, shaggy, tough-looking creatures with intelligent eyes and a certain wariness that suggests they're only semi-domesticated, or domesticated in a way that preserves their essential horseness rather than breeding it out. A few of the horses raise their heads to watch you approach, ears swivelling forward with interest. One of them snorts, a surprisingly loud sound that makes you jump slightly, but none of them seem particularly alarmed by your presence. You're just another creature moving across their grassland, notable but not threatening. People move between the felt houses with a kind of purposeful casualness, engaged in the hundreds of small tasks that make up daily life anywhere, though the specific details are unfamiliar. You see someone working on what appears to be a saddle, the leather worn smooth from use. Another person is doing something with felt, pounding it, maybe, or working new wool into an existing piece. A child runs past chasing what might be a puppy or possibly a young fox kit, laughing in the universal language of kids playing with animals. No one seems particularly surprised by your presence, which is either very welcoming or suggests that strangers wandering in off the steppe isn't especially unusual. Given the vast distances involved, you suspect it might actually be the latter. When your nearest neighbours live days of travel away, the occasional unexpected visitor is probably just part of life. The smell of the camp reaches you before you arrive. Not unpleasant, just distinct. Wood smoke, definitely, from fires burning dry dung mixed with what wood they've managed to gather. Horse, a warm animal smell that's stronger than you expected. Leather and felt and wool, the sense of worked animal materials. Something cooking that makes your stomach suddenly remind you that you haven't eaten recently. A woman glances up from her work. She's doing something intricate with leather strips, braiding them into a complex pattern, and nods in your direction. Not quite a greeting, not quite acknowledgement, just a recognition of your existence. You nod back, feeling slightly awkward about the whole interaction, but grateful that at least you haven't been immediately challenged or questioned. You realise, standing here at the edge of this mobile community, that you've been thinking about architecture all wrong. You've been trained to think of buildings as permanent things, as structures that assert themselves against the landscape and time. But these felt houses, these portable homes, are a different kind of architecture entirely. They're designed not to last forever in one place, but to last through constant movement, through assembly and disassembly, through the seasonal migrations that define Scythian life. The wooden frame of the nearest dwelling catches your eye. It's ingenious, really. A collapsible lattice structure that can expand into a large circle and then fold down into something manageable for transport. The craftsmanship is excellent, each piece fitted to work with the others, the joints designed to flex and move without breaking. This isn't primitive technology, it's sophisticated engineering adapted to a completely different set of constraints than the stone buildings you're used to thinking of as advanced. The felt covering the frame is thick and dense, compressed wool that's been worked and reworked until it becomes almost waterproof. You reach out to touch it. The texture is surprisingly pleasant, slightly rough but not scratchy, with a satisfying density that suggests it would provide real insulation against both heat and cold. The geometric patterns aren't just decorative, you realise. They're also structural, the different coloured felts sewn together in ways that reinforce stress points and provide flexibility where the structure needs to bend. A gust of wind hits the camp, strong enough that you instinctively brace yourself. The felt houses barely react. They were designed for this, built by people who understand wind not as an occasional nuisance but as a constant presence, a force that shapes daily life as surely as gravity. The rounded tops and flexible frames simply absorb the gust, giving slightly and then settling back like breathing. You're beginning to understand that what you're looking at isn't the absence of architecture but a different philosophy of building entirely. The Scythians aren't people without homes, they're people whose homes travel with them, whose concept of shelter is fundamentally mobile, designed for a life that refuses to stay in one place. The sun has started its descent toward the horizon, and the quality of light is changing. Everything takes on a golden cast, the grass turning almost luminous, the felt houses glowing warmly. Shadows lengthen across the steppe, stretching toward the east, making the subtle undulations of the land more visible. It's the kind of light that photographers dream about, though of course photography won't be invented for more than 2,000 years. Someone has started a fire in the centre of the camp and people are beginning to gather around it. Not in any formal way, just the natural drift of people toward warmth and light as the day cools. You find yourself drifting in that direction too, drawn by the same basic human instinct toward fire and community. The smoke rises straight up for a few feet and then gets caught by the wind, streaming away toward the east in a thin line. The fire itself burns with a steady orange-yellow flame, the fuel, dried animal dung you're fairly certain, burning cleanly and giving off more heat than you expected. There's an art to building a fire that burns well without much smoke, and whoever built this one clearly knows what they're doing. You settle onto the ground at a respectful distance from the fire, watching the flames and letting the day's observations settle into something approaching understanding. The grass around you is already cooling, releasing the day's accumulated heat into the darkening sky. Stars are beginning to appear, though the sky is still too bright for the full spectacular display you know is coming. This is a world before borders became fixed lines, before maps could accurately represent the territories of nations, before the idea that people should stay in one place became the default assumption of civilization. The Scythians move across these grasslands following patterns that are ancient and new simultaneously. Ancient in the sense that humans have been migrating with the seasons since before recorded history. New in that each year's journey is slightly different, adapted to current conditions, responsive to where the grass is best and the water most reliable. Tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, or perhaps a month from now, this camp will be gone. The felt houses will be collapsed, the frames folded, everything packed onto horses or carts or carried by hand. The people will move on to wherever the seasons and the grass and the horses and their own accumulated knowledge of the steppe tell them to go. The only evidence they were here will be the circular patches where the grass was compressed, and even those will spring back within days, erasing almost all evidence of human presence. But for now, tonight, this is home. Temporary and permanent, mobile and settled. A dwelling place that exists in the constant dance between movement and rest that defines nomadic life. You watch the fire and wait for full darkness, when the stars will transform the sky into something beyond describing, and you think about architecture that moves. The morning arrives with cold clarity. You wake up, assuming you actually slept, which is ambiguous in this kind of observational experience, to find the world wrapped in the particular chill that comes just before sunrise on the steppe. The grass is heavy with dew, each seed head decorated with tiny droplets that will catch the light spectacularly in about 20 minutes. For now, though, everything is grey and hushed, the sky gradually brightening from deep blue-black to something lighter, but not yet colourful. Your breath makes small clouds in the air, which is actually kind of delightful in that way that visible breath always is, making you feel like a minor dragon. You're wrapped in something woolen and surprisingly warm, a blanket or cloak that someone must have provided while you were sleeping, which is kind of them and also slightly concerning, in terms of how deeply you were apparently unconscious. The camp is already active. People who live by daylight and weather and animal behaviour tend to be early risers, synced to natural cycles in ways that people with artificial lighting never quite manage. You can see figures moving between the felt houses, hear the low sounds of morning tasks being undertaken, the metallic sounds of tools, the softer sounds of textiles being worked, the occasional snort or whinny from horses. Someone is building up the fire from last night's embers, carefully adding fuel and blowing gently to encourage flames. You watch the process with the fascination of someone who intellectually knows how fires work, but has never actually had to build one from scratch. The person working the fire has it down to a routine art form, the precise placement of tinder, the measured breath that feeds oxygen without scattering ashes, the gradual addition of larger fuel once the small stuff catches. Within minutes, there's a respectable fire going, and the first true warmth of the day begins to radiate outward. Other people drift toward it, hands extended toward the heat, and you're reminded that humans have been doing exactly this for tens of thousands of years, gathering around fire in the morning, sharing warmth before the day's work begins. The sun breaks the horizon. It's one of those sunrises that makes you understand why ancient peoples worshipped solar deities. The entire eastern sky ignites, going from grey to gold to something beyond gold, a colour that doesn't have a proper name because it exists only in those few minutes when the sun is climbing out of the earth. The clouds catch fire, the grass catches fire, everything is momentarily transformed into light and colour, and even though you know perfectly well that this is just the result of atmospheric scattering and the angle of incident radiation, it still feels like magic. The dew on the grass becomes a billion tiny prisms, each droplet splitting light into miniature rainbows. The whole steppe sparkles like someone scattered diamonds across it, though the effect will last only until the sun climbs high enough that the dew evaporates. For now, though, you're standing in a landscape made of light and water and grass, temporarily jewelled. A horse walks past you, close enough that you could reach out and touch it if you were inclined to potentially get bitten. The horse pays you no attention whatsoever, focused on the serious business of morning grazing, pulling up mouthfuls of grass and chewing with the methodical thoroughness of an animal that spends most of its waking hours eating. The sound of its chewing is surprisingly loud and somehow comforting. The solid, organic sound of an animal doing exactly what it evolved to do. You notice, now that there's enough light to see properly, that the camp's layout follows a pattern you didn't recognise last night. The felt houses aren't randomly scattered, but arranged in a loose circle, openings generally facing east, toward the rising sun and away from the prevailing winds, which typically come from the west. In the centre of this circle is the communal space where the fire burns, where people gather, where the social life of the group takes place. It's a layout that's both practical and symbolic, creating a shared interior space while maintaining the individual domains of each household. The circle also means that everyone can see everyone else, that privacy is minimal, that life is fundamentally communal in ways that later, more individualistic societies will find difficult to imagine. A child emerges from one of the felt houses, rubbing sleep from their eyes and looking wonderfully grumpy about being awake. The child can't be more than 5 or 6, wearing what appears to be a miniature version of adult clothing. Woolen trousers, a long tunic, a belt that's definitely too large and has been tied into a complicated knot to make it fit. The child spots you, stares for a moment with the unself-conscious directness that only small children can manage, then apparently decides you're not particularly interesting and wanders off toward the fire. An adult, possibly a parent, possibly just whoever is nearby, hands the child something that might be food wrapped in bread, or possibly just bread shaped like a pouch. The child accepts it with both hands, takes an enormous bite, and then wanders off again, chewing and looking at the horses with an expression that suggests big plans are being formulated. You're watching nomadic childhood, which operates on somewhat different principles than the childhood you might be familiar with. Children here learn by observation and participation rather than formal instruction. That kid is probably already competent at a dozen tasks that seem advanced for their age, helping to pack and unpack the household, tending animals, maybe even riding horses, since Scythian children apparently learn to ride almost as soon as they can walk. A woman approaches the fire carrying a large ceramic pot, which she sets carefully at the fire's edge, angled so that the heat will warm whatever's inside without causing it to boil over. She adjusts its position with a stick, making small corrections until she's satisfied with the placement, then straightens and stretches, her spine making small popping sounds that you can hear from several feet away. The universal experience of backs that aren't quite as flexible as they used to be transcends time and culture. She notices you watching and smiles, not the polite formal smile of someone acknowledging a stranger, but something warmer and slightly amused, as if your presence is mildly entertaining in a pleasant way. You smile back, attempting to convey friendliness without understanding enough about local customs to know what's actually appropriate. She says something in a language you don't understand, the syllables flowing together in patterns that don't map onto any linguistic structure you recognize. You make an apologetic gesture, universal language for "I have no idea what you just said," and she laughs, not unkindly. She points to the pot, makes a stirring motion, then gestures toward the sky with an expression that you interpret as, "It will be ready when it's ready." You nod, understanding the general concept if not the specifics. Food is cooking. Patience is required. These are truths that span all human cultures. The morning progresses, and you begin to see the camp's daily rhythm establish itself. People move between tasks with a fluidity that suggests everyone knows what needs doing, without requiring explicit coordination. Someone is working on a saddle, stitching new leather where the old is worn through. Someone else is combing wool, pulling it into long fibres that will eventually become felt or thread. Two people are engaged in a complex discussion involving much pointing at horses and what appears to be negotiation or possibly just detailed observation. What strikes you most is the absence of rush. Things get done, but without the frantic energy of people racing against artificial deadlines. Work proceeds at a pace determined by the work itself, by the natural rhythm of tasks that can't be hurried. Leather needs the time it needs to be properly worked. Felt requires however many repetitions of wetting and pounding and drying it requires. Animals move at their own speed. This isn't laziness or lack of productivity. It's a different relationship with time entirely, one where the day's rhythm is determined by sun and animals and the requirements of materials rather than by clocks and schedules. Things happen when they need to happen, and trying to force them to happen faster would accomplish nothing except worse results. A man walks past carrying what appears to be a partially disassembled bow, the wooden pieces carefully wrapped in leather. He's heading toward a work area where several people are engaged in what looks like a crafts collective. Different people working on different projects, but in companionable proximity, close enough to share tools and conversation, but not so close that they're crowding each other. You follow at a distance, curious about the bow. Scythian bows are famous, or will be famous, or are famous in certain circles. Time is complicated, for their design and effectiveness. They're composite bows, made from multiple materials laminated together to create something stronger and more flexible than any single material could achieve. Wood, horn, sinew, all carefully shaped and glued and bound into a weapon that can fire arrows with devastating force. The man settles into his workspace and begins carefully unwrapping the bow components. You edge closer, trying not to be obvious about your fascination, which probably isn't working, but no one seems to mind. The bow, even partially assembled, is beautiful. Not in the decorative sense, but in the functional sense. Every curve and angle optimized for its purpose. The wood has been carved and shaped with extraordinary precision. The horn, from a mountain goat you think, though you're not certain, has been worked until it's almost translucent in places. The man picks up what appears to be a glue pot, examining the contents with a critical eye. He adds something to it, you can't quite see what, and sets it near the fire to warm. Bow-making adhesive made from fish bladders or tendons or other organic materials needs to be the right temperature to work properly. Too cold and it won't flow. Too hot and it degrades. The man knows exactly what he's doing. The knowledge written in his confident movements and the way he monitors the glue without seeming to pay it any direct attention. While the glue warms, he picks up a piece of sinew and begins the process of preparing it for attachment. Sinew is tensile strength incarnate. Dried tendons from animals, carefully cleaned and split into fibres, then applied to the back of the bow to give it spring and power. Preparing sinew properly is apparently tedious work, requiring patience and attention to detail that you find yourself respecting enormously. You settle onto the ground nearby, watching the process unfold. This is architecture too, though of a different kind than the felt houses. This is the architecture of tools, the design and construction of objects that extend human capability across the landscape. A Scythian bow can kill at distances that would have seemed impossible to earlier peoples. It makes the vast spaces of the steppe navigable, makes hunting viable across the enormous territories the Scythians traverse. The craftsman works steadily, his hands moving with the certainty of someone who has done this hundreds of times. He applies glue, positions sinew, wraps everything carefully to hold it in place while it dries. It's meditative work, repetitive but requiring constant attention. The kind of task that lets the mind wander while the hands stay busy. Other people come and go from the work area. Someone brings tea, or something tea-like, a hot beverage in wooden cups that steams in the morning air. The bowmaker accepts a cup with a nod of thanks, sets it carefully away from his work where it won't get knocked over, and continues his patient assembly of wood and horn and sinew into something that can change the relationship between human and distance. The sun climbs higher, burning off the last of the morning cool. The day is going to be warm, you can tell, though probably not unpleasantly hot. The steppe has a way of moderating temperature through sheer scale. Heat dissipates across all that open space, and there's usually enough wind to keep things comfortable. You think about the Greek historians who will eventually write about the Scythians, trying to describe these people and their way of life to audiences who find the whole concept baffling. Herodotus will call them barbarians, which for him simply means non-Greek, but which later readers will interpret as primitive or uncivilized. He'll describe their customs with a mixture of fascination and incomprehension, recording details accurately while completely missing the logic that underlies them. How do you explain nomadic architecture to people whose entire concept of civilization is based on permanent settlement? How do you make them understand that moving isn't the absence of stability, but a different kind of stability? One based on seasonal cycles and ecological knowledge rather than on staying in one place and forcing the land to continuously produce. The felt houses around you are the product of sophisticated environmental engineering. They're designed to be warm in winter and cool in summer, to shed rain and snow, to withstand wind that would damage rigid structures, to be assembled and disassembled by people who might need to move on short notice. They're perfectly adapted to the lives of people who follow grass and water and game across distances that make permanent settlement impractical. But from the outside, from the perspective of people who build in stone and think in terms of monuments meant to last millennia, All of this looks like the absence of building rather than a different kind of building. The Scythians will be described as people without cities, without temples, without architecture, when really they have all of those things. They've just designed them to move. A commotion draws your attention back to the present. Several horses have apparently decided to investigate the camp more closely, and one of them is very interested in the felt house nearest you. The horse is stretching its neck forward, sniffing at the felt covering with obvious curiosity, and appears to be considering whether the decorative wool tassels might be edible. A teenager runs over, making shooing motions and speaking in firm tones that the horse completely ignores. The horse continues its investigation of the tassels, now giving one of them an experimental nibble. The teenager looks around for help, spots an adult who might be a parent, and calls out with the universal tone of, "Your animal is doing a thing and I'm not sure how to stop it." The adult saunters over, there's really no other word for that particular pace, and simply stands near the horse, not touching it or making any dramatic gestures. The horse looks at the adult, has what appears to be a brief internal debate about whether tassel nibbling is worth whatever consequences might follow, and apparently decides it's not. The horse snorts, shakes its head in a gesture that looks remarkably like a shrug, and wanders off to investigate something else. The teenager looks relieved. The adult looks amused. You're reminded that living with animals means constant low-level negotiation with creatures that have their own agendas and absolutely no interest in human concepts of appropriate behaviour. The morning settles into its middle phase, when the day is fully established but hasn't yet started thinking about becoming afternoon. You find yourself, despite having no official status or role in this community, oddly at home. Maybe it's the fundamental hospitality of nomadic peoples, who know that today's stranger might be tomorrow's crucial ally in a landscape where help can be days away. Maybe it's just that the Scythians have better things to do than worry about one extra person sitting quietly near their fire. Whatever the reason, you're here, watching a civilization that history will mostly forget, express itself through movement, through portable homes, through tools designed for transport, through a relationship with landscape that refuses the permanence that later peoples will consider the mark of true civilization. The grass ripples in waves that flow toward the horizon. The felt houses stand in their circle, temporary and enduring. The bowmaker continues his careful work, building precision into wood and horn, and you sit in the morning sun, learning to see architecture in motion. The burial mound rises from the steppe like a held breath. You're several miles from the mobile camp now, walking through grass that shows no signs of recent human passage. The mound appears gradually as you approach, first as a subtle irregularity in the horizon, then as a definite rise, finally as an unmistakable human-made structure that breaks the endless horizontal with deliberate verticality. It's called a kurgan, though you won't know that term for a while. The word will come from Turkic languages, but the structures themselves predate the term by thousands of years, stretching back into the deep past when people first decided that burial required monumentality, that death deserved to be marked in ways that would outlast memory. This particular kurgan is old. Not ancient by the standards of geological time, but old enough that grass has completely reclaimed it. Old enough that it looks almost natural, like a feature the steppe produced organically rather than something deliberately constructed. It's maybe 40 feet in diameter at the base, rising to a height of perhaps 15 feet at its rounded summit. Substantial but not overwhelming, a human-scale assertion of permanence in a landscape defined by impermanence. You circle the mound slowly, taking in details. The sides are gentle slopes, gradual enough that grass grows on them without difficulty, creating a green dome that mirrors the rounded shapes of the felt houses you left behind. But where the houses are designed to move, this is designed to stay. This is architecture that refuses mobility, that insists on marking one specific point on the endless steppe and saying, "Here, something important happened here." The grass on the mound is different from the grass around it. Shorter, denser, a slightly different colour. You're not botanist enough to know whether that's because the soil of the mound has different properties, or because the raised position exposes it to more wind and sun, or because the people who built it deliberately planted different species. Probably some combination of all three, plus factors you haven't even considered. At the summit there's a depression, erosion, possibly, or maybe the original construction included a hollow at the top for reasons that aren't immediately clear. Some kurgans have stone markers at their peaks, but this one doesn't, or if it did they've long since been removed or buried by accumulating soil and vegetation. You sit down at the base of the mound, your back against the slope, and think about permanence and impermanence, about the strange juxtaposition of a nomadic people who live in portable houses but bury their dead in monuments meant to last. The contradiction isn't actually contradictory once you think about it. The living move because they must, following resources across the landscape. The dead have no such requirement. The dead can stay. The day is warm and still, one of those perfect steppe days where the weather seems to take a break from doing anything dramatic and just settles into being pleasant. A few clouds drift across the sky, their shadows moving across the grass like dark water flowing. You can see for miles in every direction, the horizon a clean line where grass meets sky, broken only by the occasional slight rise or distant cluster of what might be trees marking a watercourse. Somewhere inside this mound, probably 15 or 20 feet directly beneath where you're sitting, someone is buried, possibly several someones. Kurgan burials often include not just the primary deceased, but also companions, servants, horses, grave goods, all the things the dead person might need in whatever afterlife the Scythians imagined. The larger kurgans are essentially underground chambers, carefully constructed wooden or stone rooms that were then covered with earth and turf, creating artificial hills that would mark the graves for centuries. You won't see inside this particular kurgan. The technology and ethics of excavating burial mounds won't exist for more than 2,000 years. But you know, in the vague way that this entire experience involves knowing things you couldn't possibly know, what's probably down there? Gold objects, probably. Decorative plaques. Jewellery. Ceremonial weapons. All displaying the distinctive Scythian style with its emphasis on animal motifs and flowing dynamic compositions. Textiles that have somehow survived, preserved by the particular conditions of the burial chamber. Wooden objects, leather, felt, the organic materials that usually decay but sometimes under the right circumstances endure. And possibly, though this is rarer, actual bodies, freeze-dried or otherwise preserved well enough that modern archaeologists will be able to study them, learning about diet and disease and the physical reality of people who have been dead for millennia. A bird lands on top of the kurgan, something small and brown that immediately begins searching for insects or seeds, or whatever small brown steppe birds eat. The bird hops around the summit, pausing occasionally to peck at the ground, completely unconcerned with the archaeological and historical significance of its perch. To the bird, this is just a convenient raised area that offers good visibility and probably attracts insects. You watch the bird for a while, grateful for its company and its complete lack of reverence for the dead. There's something appropriate about the way life simply continues, the way the steppe absorbs even deliberate monuments back into its ongoing processes. The kurgan is a grave, yes, but it's also a habitat for grass and birds and whatever small mammals burrow into its sides. The dead remain, but the living don't particularly care. The wind picks up slightly, and you hear something that takes you a moment to identify. The sound of the grass itself, millions of stalks rubbing against each other, creating a kind of organic white noise that's just at the edge of audibility. It's the sound of the steppe itself, the ambient audio of all that space and vegetation and wind. Once you notice it, it's hard to unnotice, and you realise it's been there all along, so constant that your brain filtered it out as irrelevant information. You think about the Greek and Persian observers who will encounter the Scythians, trying to fit these mobile people into frameworks designed for sedentary civilizations. Herodotus will record Scythian customs with remarkable detail. The ritual use of cannabis in steam baths, the drinking of wine mixed with blood, the scalping of enemies, the mobile felt houses. But he'll struggle to make sense of a culture that refuses to stay put. The Greeks associate civilization with cities, with walls and temples and agoras, with architecture that announces permanence and importance. The Scythians have none of those things, and therefore seem to the Greeks to be living in a kind of pre-civilized state, as if nomadism represents an earlier stage of development, rather than a sophisticated adaptation to specific environmental conditions. The Persians, under Darius, will actually try to conquer the Scythians, and the campaign will fail spectacularly precisely because the Scythians refuse to fight according to expected rules. They'll retreat continuously, drawing the Persian army deeper into the steppe, away from their supply lines, into territory where the Scythians' mobility gives them every advantage. The Persians will find nothing to conquer, no cities to besiege, no fixed positions to capture, just endless grass and an enemy that appears, harasses them, and vanishes before they can respond effectively. Darius will eventually give up and retreat, frustrated and depleted, having learned the hard way that military strategies designed for fighting settled peoples are useless against nomads who treat the entire landscape as their fortress. You shift position, and the grass rustles around you. The kurgan behind you feels solid and permanent, a point of stability in the flowing world of the steppe. This is what the Scythians built to last. Not palaces or temples, but graves. Their monuments are to the dead, not the living. The living need flexibility, mobility, the ability to move with seasons and opportunities and threats. The dead need only to be remembered, and a hill of earth that will stand for thousands of years is memory made tangible. The small brown bird on top of the kurgan takes off suddenly, alarmed by something you didn't notice. It flies away in a series of swooping arcs, calling sharply, and disappears into the grass somewhere to the north. You're alone again, or as alone as you can be while sitting on top of a grave that's also an ecosystem, that's also a monument, that's also just a hill. Time does strange things when you sit still on the steppe. Without constant activity or artificial time markers, minutes and hours become fluid, marked only by the sun's slow arc and the gradual changes in light and temperature. You could have been sitting here for 20 minutes or 2 hours. Both feel equally plausible, and neither feels particularly important. Your thoughts wander across subjects with the same kind of gentle aimlessness that the clouds show overhead. You think about your own culture's relationship with death and burial, the ways different societies mark the end of life. You think about permanence and whether anything really lasts, or whether even stone eventually crumbles and grass reclaims everything. You think about the people buried beneath you, who they were and what they thought about, and whether they imagined that thousands of years later, someone would be sitting on top of their grave thinking vague thoughts about mortality and grass. The sun shifts lower, and the quality of light begins to change again, the brightness softening into something gentler, the shadows starting to lengthen. You realize you've been sitting here for quite a while, lost in the particular kind of meditation that large empty spaces can induce. You stand up, brushing grass seeds off your clothes, and take one more look at the kurgan. It rises from the steppe with simple dignity, neither grandiose nor humble, just present. A statement in earth and grass that some person or people died here, and the community deemed them worthy of remembrance in the most permanent form available. You start walking back toward where you think the mobile camp was, though you're not entirely certain of the direction. The steppe has a way of looking the same in all directions, and you realize with some amusement that you could easily get lost out here. Nomadic peoples must develop extraordinary navigation skills, learning to read the subtle variations in the landscape, the positions of the sun and stars, the direction of prevailing winds, all the small clues that distinguish one piece of grass from another piece of grass. The grass whispers around you as you walk. The sky begins its slow transition toward evening, and behind you, the kurgan remains, holding its secrets in the dark earth, marking a point on the infinite steppe where someone decided that this at least would not move. You return to find the camp in a state of controlled chaos. Not the panicked kind of chaos that suggests emergency or disaster, but the purposeful chaos of people doing many things simultaneously in preparation for something significant. The felt houses are coming down, or rather one of them is coming down, which you watch with the fascination of someone seeing a complicated process for the first time. A family, you assume it's a family, though the relationships might be more complex than that word suggests, is efficiently dismantling their home with movements that speak of countless repetitions. The felt covering comes off first, carefully unpinned from the wooden frame beneath. It's not a single piece, you realise, but multiple panels sewn together, designed so they can be separated for transport and repair. Two people, probably parents, possibly siblings, work together to fold the felt, creating neat bundles that will pack efficiently onto a cart or horse. The felt is still slightly damp from morning dew, and as they work you can smell it. Wet wool has a distinctive scent, musty but not unpleasant, organic, and animal. Steam rises from the folds where body heat and ambient warmth meet the damp fabric. With the felt removed, the wooden frame stands exposed, a lattice structure that looks far more delicate than it did when covered. The frame is made of willow, you think, or some similar wood that combines flexibility with strength. The pieces are fitted together with leather straps rather than nails or rigid joints, creating a structure that can flex and move without breaking. A man, definitely the household head, based on the way he's directing operations, begins collapsing the frame. This is clearly the tricky part, requiring knowledge of exactly which pieces to loosen, in which order, so the structure folds properly rather than jamming or breaking. He works methodically, releasing tension here, shifting weight there, and gradually the circular frame begins to compress. The lattice panels folding into each other like a complex geometric puzzle. A teenager helps, supporting parts of the frame as they fold, keeping pieces from falling or twisting incorrectly. The teenager's face shows intense concentration. This is learned skill, not casual labour, and getting it wrong would mean damaged equipment and significant inconvenience. You suspect the teenager has been doing this since childhood, but is still in that stage of competence where the work requires full attention rather than operating on automatic. Within 15 minutes, the entire dwelling has been reduced to manageable bundles, rolls of felt, folded frame pieces, various household goods carefully packed. A cart appears, pulled by a patient-looking ox who seems completely unbothered by the activity. The bundles get loaded with careful attention to weight distribution and balance, everything strapped down securely. You watch other households undertaking similar processes, each with slight variations based on family size, amount of stuff, available animals for transport. Some people are loading horses directly, creating complex arrangements of bundles and bags balanced on either side of the animal. Others have more elaborate carts, two-wheeled affairs that can carry substantial loads across the rough terrain. Children run around helping and occasionally hindering, carrying small items that probably aren't actually essential but keeps them involved and feeling useful. A small kid, maybe 3 years old, is very seriously transporting what appears to be a wooden bowl from one location to another, taking the responsibility extremely seriously, face scrunched with concentration. An older woman sits on what's already been packed, directing operations without actually doing much physical labour. This is probably earned privilege. Age and experience mean she knows exactly how everything should be done and can spot mistakes before they become problems, while younger, stronger people do the actual heavy lifting. You notice that nothing is wasted. Nothing. Every scrap of felt gets packed, every piece of rope carefully coiled, every tool accounted for. When you live mobile, losing things means doing without until you can replace them, which might be impossible for months. The Scythians treat their possessions with care, not because they're precious in a sentimental sense, but because they're functional necessities that can't be easily replaced. The social dynamics of packing are interesting to watch. People help each other without being asked, moving between households as needed, everyone understanding that efficient packing benefits everyone. There's no sense of individual families struggling alone. This is communal work, even though each household manages its own belongings. Someone has started a last fire, smaller than the usual communal fire, clearly meant to burn quickly and completely. A few people gather around it, making tea or cooking something quick, taking a moment of rest before the actual movement begins. You drift toward the fire, drawn by the same basic attraction that's been drawing humans to flames since we first figured out how to make them. The woman you saw earlier, the one who was amused by your linguistic incompetence, is at the fire, stirring something in a pot. She sees you and gestures toward a stack of wooden bowls, clearly indicating you should help yourself. You take a bowl gratefully, and she ladles something into it. A kind of porridge or grain mixture, thick and steaming, with small pieces of what might be dried meat mixed in. You find a spot to sit and taste the food. It's good, hearty and warming, seasoned with something herbal you don't recognise, the texture substantial without being heavy. The kind of food that makes sense for people about to spend hours travelling, providing energy that will last. A man sits down near you, eating his own portion, with the efficient movements of someone refuelling rather than savouring. He's middle-aged, you'd guess, with the weathered face of someone who spent their entire life outdoors. He nods in your direction, acknowledgement without the need for conversation, and continues eating. You eat in companionable silence, watching the last preparations unfold around you. The camp that was home last night is systematically disappearing, transforming from a settled place to a collection of portable components ready for movement. It's like watching a building walk away, architecture deciding it would rather be somewhere else. The last fell house comes down, and suddenly the space looks entirely different. Where there was a circle of dwellings creating an interior courtyard, there's now just open steppe, marked only by circular patches where the grass is compressed and the ground is slightly more packed. In a week, those marks will be nearly invisible. In a month, you'd never know anyone had been here. The woman with the pot calls out something and people begin gathering their bowls, the last meal in this location coming to its conclusion. The fire gets carefully extinguished, the ashes scattered, the stones that mark the fire pit collected and packed. Leave no trace isn't just an ethics here, it's practical necessity, not wasting resources or leaving evidence that might attract unwanted attention from whoever might pass this way next. Horses are being brought in from their grazing, caught with practiced ease by people who know each animal individually. The horses get fitted with saddles or pack arrangements, some accepting this with patient resignation, others dancing slightly, eager to move. The oxen pulling carts get hitched to their loads, standing placidly while people adjust harnesses and check connections. The social order of travel is apparently well established. Certain people take positions at the front, scouts probably, or just experienced navigators who know the route. Families group together, keeping their animals and children within sight. The most heavily loaded carts position themselves in the middle of the forming column, where they can be easily helped if they encounter difficulty. You realise you're about to witness nomadic movement, the fundamental activity that defines Scythian culture. These people are about to pick up their entire civilization and carry it across the steppe to wherever they've decided to go next, following patterns that are simultaneously ancient and improvised, traditional and responsive to current conditions. A man on horseback rides along the forming column, calling out something that's probably organisational instructions or possibly just encouragement. His horse is beautiful, a compact animal with an intelligent face, moving with the kind of casual competence that suggests excellent training and mutual understanding between rider and mount. Children are being loaded onto carts or lifted onto horses, positioned where they can ride safely. The very young get secured somehow. You can't see exactly how from this distance, but presumably tied or held, in ways that keep them from falling even if they fall asleep. Older children ride independently, managing horses that seem too large for them but apparently aren't. The column begins to move. It's not a dramatic departure, No speeches or ceremonies, just a practical decision that now is the time to go. The leading horses step forward, and everyone else follows, the whole group flowing into motion like a river deciding to move downstream. You find yourself walking alongside, unsure of your exact position but accepted as part of the migration through sheer presence. Nobody questions you being there. You're just another person moving with the group, and that seems to be sufficient. The pace is moderate, not rushed but steady. The speed of heavily loaded animals carrying everything a community owns. The horses step carefully through the grass, finding their footing on the uneven ground. The cartwheels creak and bounce, creating a rhythmic sound that settles into background noise after a few minutes. People talk as they walk, calling to each other across the column, sharing observations or jokes, or just maintaining social connection during the journey. Children alternate between excitement and boredom, thrilled by the movement until the novelty wears off, and they start asking questions that probably translate to, "Are we there yet?" in every language. The grass flows past on both sides, endless and varied, never quite the same but never entirely different. The sky is enormous above you, blue and deep and scattered with clouds that move at their own pace, unconnected to the human procession below. You're walking through history, watching architecture refuse to stay still, seeing a civilization that built its entire culture around the premise that home is wherever you decide to stop for the night. The felt houses are somewhere in those loaded carts, compressed and packed, waiting to become dwellings again whenever the group decides it's time to settle, however temporarily. The steppe stretches ahead, distance made visible, space transformed into possibility. And you walk forward with the Scythians, participating in the fundamental nomadic act of choosing movement over permanence, following the grass toward wherever the grass is best. The reality of nomadic travel is considerably less romantic than the concept. You've been walking for approximately 3 hours, and your feet hurt. This seems like a minor complaint in the grand scheme of experiencing ancient cultures, but it's remarkably present as a concern. The grass that looked so beautiful from a distance turns out to be full of small hard things that find their way into shoes, and the ground that seemed level reveals itself to be constantly varied in ways that make every step a minor negotiation. The person walking next to you, an older man with a face like weathered leather, seems entirely unbothered by the journey, maintaining a steady pace that suggests he could do this all day. Which, you realise, he probably has done, thousands of times, his entire life spent in this rhythm of movement and temporary settlement. You're trying to match his pace without looking like you're struggling, which probably isn't working. A child rides past on a horse that seems far too large, the kid's legs sticking almost straight out to the sides. The child is singing something, a repetitive song that's probably either very traditional or very annoying to parents who've been hearing it for hours. Possibly both. The horse plods along with the infinite patience of an animal that knows exactly how important it is, and has decided not to make a fuss about it. The sun has climbed to what you estimate is around mid-morning, and the temperature is rising accordingly. It's going to be warm today, probably genuinely hot by afternoon. You can feel sweat starting to gather in all the usual places, your clothing beginning to stick slightly. Nobody else seems to care, which is either because they're used to it or because complaining about weather is pointless when you're going to be in it regardless. The column has spread out somewhat from its initial compact formation. Faster walkers have naturally moved toward the front, while those with heavily loaded carts or slower animals have drifted toward the rear. You're somewhere in the middle, which feels metaphorically appropriate even if it's just where you ended up through random chance. Someone up ahead starts singing, a different song than the child's, deeper and more melodic, something that sounds like it might have actual historical or cultural significance, rather than just being noise for entertainment. Other voices join in gradually, creating a kind of mobile choir, the music helping to mark the rhythm of walking and making the time pass more pleasantly. You don't know the words, but you can hear the pattern. the way the melody rises and falls, the places where voices come together in something approaching harmony. It's travel music, music designed for walking, and it works exactly as intended, making the next hour of steady movement feel less tedious. The landscape changes so gradually that you don't notice until it's already different. The grass is slightly shorter here, the ground a bit firmer, suggesting different soil conditions or drainage patterns. Small flowers you didn't see earlier dot the grassland, tiny yellow blooms that manage to be cheerful without being aggressive about it. A break is called, or rather, the front of the column simply stops, and everyone else follows suit, the message propagating backward through the group. People immediately begin taking care of necessities, checking animals, adjusting loads, attending to biological requirements, with the casual efficiency of people unbothered by lack of privacy. You sit down in the grass, grateful for the rest, and accept water from a skin someone passes to you. The water tastes slightly of whatever the container is made from, leather probably, but it's wet and cool and exactly what you need. You drink deeply and pass it back with a nod of thanks. Children are running around using their sudden freedom of movement to work out energy that's been building during the constrained walking. They're playing some kind of chasing game with rules you don't understand but which seem to be universally accepted by the participants. An adult calls out something that probably means, "Don't go too far," which the children acknowledge and then mostly ignore. The horses and oxen are grazing, taking advantage of the stop to eat. The efficiency is impressive. No time is wasted. Animals feed while humans rest, everyone getting what they need from the break. A few people have produced food from packs, sharing dried meat and hard cheese and travel bread, the kind of food that keeps forever and requires no preparation. You notice that the scouts who are riding ahead have returned, and are in consultation with several people who seem to be elders or leaders or just respected voices. They're pointing in various directions, clearly discussing route options, reading the landscape in ways you can't even perceive. To you, the step ahead looks identical to the step behind, but to them it's apparently full of significant information, where water is likely to be, which routes have better grazing, what areas to avoid for reasons of terrain or politics or animal behaviour. The consultation concludes with what appears to be consensus, and the scouts ride off again, heading in a direction that's slightly different from the line you were following before. The route adjusts, responsive to current conditions, the journey more improvisation than fixed plan. The break extends for maybe 30 minutes. Long enough for real rest, but not so long that momentum is lost. Then, without any obvious signal, people begin standing up, gathering children, checking animals, preparing to continue. The cultural knowledge of when break is over is apparently universal, everyone knowing simultaneously that it's time to move again. The column reforms and continues, now heading in the adjusted direction. You fall back into the walking rhythm, your feet still protesting but no longer quite as urgently. This is your life now, walking across the steppe with the Scythians, participating in the fundamental activity that defines their existence. The afternoon develops slowly. The sun climbs toward its peak, the temperature rising, the light becoming harsher and less forgiving. People are quieter now, saving energy, the morning singing having given way to focused movement. Even the children are less energetic, several of them having been loaded onto carts where they can rest or sleep while the adults keep walking. You pass another kurgan, this one more distant, visible as a slight rise against the horizon. Nobody pays it particular attention. Burial mounds are just part of the landscape, common enough that each individual one isn't remarkable. The dead are there, the living are here, and the steppe contains both without comment. A bird of prey circles overhead, riding thermals that are invisible to you but apparently quite real to the bird. It hangs in the sky without visible effort, scanning the ground for something small and edible. You watch it for a while, grateful for the distraction, until it suddenly folds its wings and drops like a stone towards something you can't see in the grass. Whether it caught anything is unclear from this distance. The walking continues. Your legs have progressed through pain into a kind of numb acceptance, your body adjusting to the sustained effort in the way bodies do, when they realise complaining isn't going to change anything. You're getting better at reading the ground, stepping more efficiently, finding the rhythm that makes distance manageable. The sun begins its descent, and you realise with some relief that the day's travel must be approaching its end. The scouts have returned again and are conferring with the leaders, presumably about where to stop for the night. The consultation is brief. Apparently there's an obvious choice, or at least an acceptable one. The column adjusts course slightly and continues for another half hour or so, until you crest a gentle rise and see what's below. A shallow valley with a stream running through it, grass that looks particularly green and healthy, a few scattered trees that seem enormously significant after hours of treeless steppe. This is tonight's campsite. The column descends into the valley, people and animals flowing downhill toward the water with visible relief. The day's journey is complete. Tomorrow there will be another day of walking, and the day after that another, and so on for as long as the Scythians need to move. But tonight there will be felt houses and fires and food and rest. The architecture begins to reassemble itself. Setting up camp is essentially the morning's disassembly in reverse, but somehow more complex. The same family you watched pack up this morning is now unpacking, and you're struck by how systematic the process is. Everything was packed in a specific order to make unpacking efficient, heavy items at the bottom of loads, frequently needed things easily accessible. The felt panels come off the cart first, unrolled and checked for damage from the journey. The wooden frame pieces follow, each one carefully inspected for cracks or stress points that might have developed during transport. The site they've chosen for their dwelling is flat and slightly elevated from the surrounding area, good drainage in case of rain, positioned to take advantage of the natural windbreak provided by the valley's slope. These aren't casual decisions. Every aspect of placement has been considered, drawing on generations of knowledge about where to put a felt house for maximum comfort and minimum problems. The frame goes up first. 2 people work together, fitting the lattice pieces into place, connecting them with leather straps, gradually expanding the circular structure. There's a rhythm to it, a practiced coordination that doesn't require much verbal communication. One person knows to hold while the other fastens, to shift weight while the other adjusts position. It's a dance they've performed countless times. A third person joins them, the teenager from this morning, and with 3 people working, the frame rises quickly, the geometric lattice expanding into its full circle. The structure is elegant in its simplicity, every piece serving multiple functions, the whole thing designed to be both strong and flexible, resistant to wind without being rigid. Once the frame is stable, the roof poles get added, long pieces that radiate from a central ring at the top like spokes in a wheel. These create the conical roof shape, transforming the cylindrical lattice into something that can shed rain and snow. The central ring will remain open, serving as a smoke hole for the fire that will eventually burn inside. The felt covering goes on last, multiple panels that get laced together and secured to the frame. This takes time and attention, making sure everything is tight enough to provide insulation but not so tight that the structure can't flex when wind hits it. The decorative patterns align as the panels connect, creating the geometric designs that make each dwelling distinctive. Within an hour, the structure that was dismantled bundles this morning as a house again, standing solid and comfortable, ready to be home for however long the Scythians stay in this valley. Around it, other dwellings are rising, the camp reassembling itself into a new configuration adapted to this particular landscape. You notice that the circle formation from the previous camp isn't being exactly replicated. The dwellings are still roughly circular in arrangement, but the specific positions have changed, adapted to the terrain, taking advantage of natural features. The community maintains its essential structure while remaining responsive to each new location. Children who were bored and restless during travel are now ecstatic, running around the emerging camp with renewed energy. The stream is a particular attraction, kids splashing in shallow water, chasing each other across the rocks, engaging in the timeless child activity of getting thoroughly wet for no particular reason. An adult calls out something that probably means Don't fall in and drown, which the children acknowledge with the universal childhood response of completely ignoring parental concern while somehow managing not to actually drown. Fires are being started throughout the camp, smoke beginning to rise in multiple thin columns. The smell of cooking starts to drift through the valley, different families preparing different foods but all creating variations on the theme of dinner after a long day of travel. Your stomach responds to the cooking smells with enthusiasm, reminding you that you've been walking for hours on minimal food. Someone appears next to you holding what looks like flatbread, wrapped around something meat-based, and gestures that you should take it. You accept gratefully, too hungry to worry about the exact nature of what you're eating. It's good, simple but satisfying, the bread still warm, the meat seasoned with herbs that taste both familiar and strange. The person who gave you the food, a woman maybe in her 30s, smiles and says something you don't understand, though the general meaning of "you looked hungry" comes through clearly enough in her expression and gesture. You smile back and make appreciative eating noises, the universal language of "thank you, this is exactly what I needed." The sun is setting now, dropping toward the western horizon and painting the sky in colours that would seem implausible if you weren't seeing them directly. Orange and pink and gold layered across each other, reflecting off the scattered clouds and creating light that makes everything look temporarily magical. The felt houses glow in the sunset light, warm and inviting, the whole camp suffused with golden hour radiance. Horses are being settled for the night, some hobbled to keep them from wandering too far, others simply released to graze with the confidence that they'll stay near the camp. The oxen that pulled carts all day are being unhitched, given water, left to rest with the satisfied air of large animals who've worked hard and know they've earned their keep. As darkness falls, the fires become more prominent, points of light and warmth scattered through the valley. People gather around them, the social pattern reasserting itself, now that the day's travel is complete. There's music again, someone playing a stringed instrument you don't recognise, the melody wandering through minor keys in a way that sounds both melancholic and oddly cheerful. You find yourself at one of the fires, sitting among people who've accepted your presence without requiring explanation. The fire crackles and pops, burning with the particular character of dried dung fuel, giving off steady heat and minimal smoke. The circle of light it creates feels like its own kind of architecture, a temporary room with walls of darkness and a ceiling of stars. Someone passes around a leather bag containing some kind of fermented beverage, and you take a careful sip when it reaches you. It's alcoholic, definitely. Something made from mare's milk perhaps, sour and strange and not entirely unpleasant. You pass it on and watch the stars begin to emerge. The stars on the steppe are extraordinary, with no competing light sources and air that's remarkably clear. The night sky becomes a dense field of light, the Milky Way visible as a luminous river flowing across the darkness. You can see why ancient peoples thought of the sky as a populated realm, full of patterns and stories and divine attention. It's hard to look at this much celestial display and not feel like the universe is paying attention. The Scythians know these stars intimately, use them for navigation and timekeeping, and probably for spiritual purposes you don't understand. The patterns overhead are as much a part of their landscape as the grass and the water, equally important for the practical business of living nomadically across vast territories. A child leans against what's probably a parent, fighting sleep, determined to stay up with the adults but clearly losing the battle. The parent adjusts position to better support the kid, continuing their conversation with someone else, while simultaneously providing a comfortable place for drowsing. The kid's eyes close, open briefly, close again, open once more in a last heroic attempt to stay conscious, and then finally surrender to sleep. The conversation around the fire continues in that pleasant evening rhythm. People talking without urgency, sharing observations about the day's travel, discussing plans for tomorrow or next week or the coming season. You understand none of the specific words, but all of the general tone. This is community maintenance, the social bonding that happens when people gather after shared effort. More children succumb to sleep, carried to the felt houses by parents who return to the fire once the kids are settled. The adult conversation becomes slightly different with the children gone, not dramatically so. Just the subtle shift that happens when the need to filter content is removed. You lean back, looking up at the stars, listening to conversations in a language you don't speak, sitting among people who live lives completely different from anything you've experienced. The felt houses around you are temporary structures that will be disassembled again whenever the Scythians decide to move. The fire you're sitting beside will be extinguished and scattered before the next journey begins. Everything here is impermanent, designed to leave minimal trace, adapted to constant movement. But in this moment, it's home. Temporary and real, mobile and settled. Architecture that accepts its own transience without apologizing for it. The fire burns lower. People begin drifting toward their dwellings. The social evening reaching its natural conclusion as tiredness overcomes the impulse to stay up. You remain at the fire a bit longer, reluctant to end the day, enjoying the last of the warmth and light. Eventually, you're the last person there, sitting alone with embers and stars at the edge of a nomadic camp on the Eurasian steppe, sometime around 700 BCE. Tomorrow the Scythians might move again, or they might stay in this valley for days or weeks, following decisions based on grass quality and animal needs, and factors you can only partially understand. But tonight, you're here, participating in a form of life that most of human history has forgotten, watching architecture refuse to acknowledge borders, seeing civilization expressed through movement rather than monuments. The embers fade to darkness. You stand, brush off grass and ash, and walk toward the felt house where apparently you're expected to sleep. The stars provide enough light to navigate by. The Milky Way a luminous road overhead. Inside the felt house it's warm and dark and smells like wool and smoke and the accumulated presence of people. You find a space to lie down, wrap yourself in the blanket someone has provided, and let the day's journey settle into sleep. Outside, the steppe stretches away in all directions, vast and dark and utterly indifferent to human concerns. The horses graze quietly. The stream makes small sounds over rocks, and the Scythian camp rests, temporary and complete, home for the night. Morning comes gently. You wake to light filtering through felt, the first sunshine of the day creating a warm amber glow that gradually brightens as your eyes adjust. The air inside the dwelling is cool but not cold, the felt insulation maintaining a comfortable temperature despite the autumn morning outside. You can hear sounds of activity already underway. Distant voices, the movement of animals, someone working with metal that creates small ringing sounds. Outside, the valley is gorgeous in early light. The stream catches the sun, reflecting it in shifting patterns that dance across the water's surface. Mist rises from warmer water meeting cool air, creating ephemeral shapes that form and dissolve continuously. The grass is heavy with dew again, each blade decorated with moisture that will evaporate within the hour. The camp has been here for 3 days now, and the temporary settlement has taken on a slightly more established feeling. Not permanent, nothing here is permanent, but settled enough that small paths have been worn between frequently visited locations, that the horses have established favourite grazing spots, that children have claimed certain areas for their play. You've been watching the Scythians work, and the variety of crafts is remarkable. People are making things constantly. Tools, textiles, decorative objects, practical items. The bowmaker you saw earlier is still at his work, now in the final stages of assembly, testing the flex and draw weight, making minute adjustments to achieve perfect balance. A group of women are working with textiles, and you drift over to watch. They're creating felt, which turns out to be a fascinating process. Raw wool gets laid out in layers, alternating the direction of fibres to create strength. Then it gets wetted and rolled and pounded, the fibres interlocking as they're worked, gradually transforming from loose wool into dense felt. It's hard physical work, requiring sustained effort and coordination. 2 women roll the felt around a long pole, pressing down with their body weight, working in rhythm. Others add water from leather containers, keeping the wool at the right moisture level. The process is methodical, repetitive, meditative in the way that handwork often becomes when you do it for hours. They're singing while they work. Not the same song from yesterday's travel, but something different, with a rhythm that matches the rolling and pounding. Work songs, you realise, designed to coordinate effort and make time pass more pleasantly. The melody is simple enough that you could probably learn it, though you'd still have no idea what the words mean. The felt they're creating will become part of a dwelling, patches to repair existing felt houses or material for new construction. The wool comes from their own sheep, processed by hand, transformed into architecture through labour that's shared among the community. There's no purchasing of building materials from external sources, no economy of specialised manufacturers. The Scythians create their own shelters from resources they produce themselves, maintaining complete self-sufficiency in their mobile existence. A child comes running over, excited about something, talking rapidly and pointing toward the stream. One of the women nods and says something that probably means, "That's nice, dear. Now go play." And the child runs off again, satisfied by the adult acknowledgement of whatever discovery prompted the visit. You walk down toward the stream, picking your way through grass that's slippery with dew. The water is clear and fast-moving, running over rocks that have been smoothed by countless years of current. Small fish dart away from your shadow, silvery flashes that disappear upstream. The water is cold when you dip your hand in it, mountain snowmelt probably, coming from heights you can't see from here. Someone is fishing downstream, not with a rod and line like you might expect, but with a woven basket trap placed strategically in the current. The technique is simple and effective. The trap's design lets fish swim in but not out, and checking it periodically yields whatever has wandered into the wrong corridor. The person checking the trap pulls out several fish of a size that suggests dinner rather than trophies, and deposits them in a leather bag to be dealt with later. The sun climbs higher, burning off the mist, warming the valley. The day is developing into something beautiful. Clear sky, moderate temperature, gentle breeze, perfect weather for the variety of tasks that outdoor living requires. You spend the morning wandering, observing, gradually understanding more about how Scythian life operates. The social structure is complex, based on kinship and clan affiliation, and probably factors you're not perceiving. There's clear respect for certain individuals, elders, skilled craftspeople, successful hunters, but no obvious rigid hierarchy. Decisions seem to emerge from consultation and consensus, rather than from authoritarian command. A group of young people, teenagers mostly, are engaged in what appears to be riding practice. They're working with horses in a cleared area, practicing mounts and dismounts, working on balance and control. One kid manages a particularly fluid mount, swinging onto the horse's back while the animal is moving, and the others call out what are probably either encouragement or good-natured mockery, possibly both. An older rider, probably an instructor, demonstrates a technique that involves shifting weight in a specific way to signal the horse. The teenagers try to replicate it with varying degrees of success, the horses responding to some attempts and ignoring others in the way that horses do when they can tell the rider isn't quite confident about what they're asking for. Horsemanship is clearly central to Scythian culture, the skill that enables everything else. These people live on horseback, travel on horseback, hunt and fight and herd animals from horseback. A Scythian without good riding skills would be like a modern person who can't read. Not impossible, but severely limited in their ability to function in society. You watch the practice session for a while, impressed by the level of skill being developed. These kids are probably more competent on horseback than many adult riders in later equestrian cultures. They're learning not just how to stay on a horse, but how to become genuinely unified with it, how to move together as a single unit, rather than as a person sitting on top of an animal. The sun reaches its peak, and the day's warmth becomes more pronounced. People seek shade where it's available, under the few trees near the stream, in the shadows cast by the felt houses, anywhere that offers relief from direct sun. It's not oppressively hot, but it's warm enough that minimal activity becomes attractive. You find a spot under a tree and sit down, your back against the trunk, watching the stream flow past. Time moves differently when you're not trying to accomplish anything specific, when you're simply present in a moment without agenda or deadline. Minutes stretch and compress, marked only by the sun's slow arc and the gradual changes in light and shadow. A young woman approaches the stream with a leather bag, kneels at the water's edge, and begins washing what appear to be wool garments. She works methodically, wetting the fabric, working it with her hands, rinsing it in the current. The wet wool smells strongly, that distinctive lanolin scent that's both pleasant and slightly overwhelming. She notices you watching and says something, probably a greeting or possibly a comment about the weather, or maybe just acknowledgement of mutual existence. You nod and smile, the universal response when you have no idea what someone said but want to seem friendly. She finishes her washing, wrings out the garments with practiced efficiency, and drapes them over bushes to dry. The wet fabric will take hours to dry completely, but in this warm breeze it will happen eventually. She walks back toward the camp, the empty bag swinging from her hand. The afternoon extends into early evening. The light begins its slow transformation, shadows lengthening, colours deepening. Someone starts preparing food and the smell of cooking begins to drift through the valley again. You realise with some surprise that you've spent an entire day doing essentially nothing. No accomplishments, no tasks completed, just observation and presence. It's a different relationship with time than you're probably used to. Modern life, with its emphasis on productivity and efficiency, leaves little room for days spent simply existing. But nomadic life apparently includes this kind of time, periods where the community stays in one place, and daily life doesn't require urgent action. Of course, everyone else has been working, making things, maintaining equipment, preparing food, tending animals, all the necessary tasks of living. Your idleness is tourist privilege, observer status that exempts you from contributing labour. But even the people working don't seem rushed or stressed. The work gets done at the pace it gets done, and that's sufficient. Dinner happens gradually, different families cooking at different times, people eating when food is ready rather than at any prescribed hour. You're offered food again. You're starting to wonder if feeding random strangers is just standard practice, or if you've somehow been adopted by this community without realising it. Either way, you're grateful for the meal, some kind of stew with chunks of meat and root vegetables and herbs that make it savoury and warming. As darkness falls, the fires become the focus again, and people gather with the same comfortable routine as the previous nights. The stars emerge, the Milky Way paints itself across the sky, and the valley becomes a small pool of light and human presence in the vast darkness of the steppe. Tonight someone tells a story. You can tell by the narrative rhythm of the speaking, the way the storyteller's voice rises and falls, the reactions of the listeners. You understand nothing of the content but everything of the form. This is epic or myth or history, possibly all three simultaneously, being transmitted orally from one generation to another, the preservation of cultural memory through performance. Children listen with rapt attention, even the ones who are usually squirmy and restless. Adults listen too, though they've probably heard this story dozens or hundreds of times. The repetition isn't boring, it's ritual, the maintenance of cultural continuity through repeated performance. The story ends and there's a moment of satisfied silence before conversation resumes. Someone else might tell another story, or they might not. The evening will unfold according to its own logic, shaped by mood and energy and who feels like talking. You sit with the Scythians under impossible stars, participating in a form of life that's doomed, though none of these people know it yet. The Scythian culture will last for centuries more, but eventually it will fade, absorbed into other peoples, changed by migrations and invasions and the slow transformation of the steppe world. The felt houses will stop being built. The seasonal migrations will end. The mobile architecture will settle into permanent towns and cities, and the knowledge of how to live entirely without fixed structures will gradually disappear. But tonight, the Scythians are here and vital and competent, living exactly as they've lived for generations, moving across the steppe with the seasons, carrying their entire civilization on their backs and calling it home. The fire burns low, stars wheel overhead, and somewhere far beyond this valley the future is approaching, though nobody here is particularly worried about it. The cold comes suddenly. Not the gentle autumn cool you've been experiencing, but serious cold, winter announcing its arrival with winds that strip warmth from the air and send temperatures plummeting. You wake up shivering despite the felt walls and the blankets, your breath making clouds in the dim interior of the dwelling. Outside, the world has transformed. The grass is stiff with frost, each blade coated in crystalline white that crunches underfoot. The stream still flows, but more sluggishly, ice forming at its edges where the current is slower. The sky's painfully clear, that particular blue-white clarity that comes with cold air masses, the sun bright but offering minimal warmth. The camp responds to the temperature drop with practiced efficiency. People are adding layers of clothing, wrapping themselves in additional felt and fur, covering heads and hands against the biting wind. The felt houses have their smoke holes partially covered to retain heat. Fires burning inside now, the interiors warm and smoky and substantially more comfortable than the frozen world outside. You venture out, curious about how the Scythians handle winter, and immediately understand why they were putting on more clothes. The cold is aggressive, finding its way through any gap in your coverage, making your face hurt and your fingers go numb within minutes. The wind doesn't help, gusting across the open valley with nothing to slow it down, carrying the cold directly into any exposed skin. The horses are clustered together, using their combined body heat for warmth, their shaggy winter coats already substantial enough to provide real insulation. They look unbothered by the temperature, continuing to graze on grass they have to paw through frost to reach. Horses evolved for this, developed in climates where winter is serious business, and these Scythian horses are particularly well adapted. The camp has contracted inward, the circle of dwellings seeming smaller, people staying closer to their individual fires, minimising time spent outside. This isn't weather for extensive outdoor work or casual socialising in open air. This is hunker down weather, stay warm weather, wait it out weather. Inside the felt houses, though, life continues with relatively minimal disruption. The structures that looked flimsy and temporary from the outside reveal themselves to be remarkably effective shelter. The felt walls provide substantial insulation. The central fire creates a zone of warmth. The low door opening minimises heat loss. The interior temperature isn't exactly tropical, but it's livable, comfortable enough to go about normal activities without constantly thinking about the cold. You spend time in one of the dwellings, watching daily life proceed in winter mode. People are working on indoor tasks, repairing equipment, working textiles, preparing food, all the activities that don't require being outside. Children play quietly, their usual running around energy constrained by the limited space, but finding expression in imaginative games that require minimal physical movement. Someone is making soup, a large pot suspended over the fire, slowly heating as various ingredients get added. The process is casual and extended, soup making as all-day activity, each person who passes contributing something. A handful of grain, some dried vegetables, bits of preserved meat. The result will be communal food, available to whoever wants it whenever they want it. A hedge against the cold that provides both nutrition and warmth. The smell of cooking fills the dwelling, competing with the smoke from the fire for dominance. Both smells together create an atmosphere that's distinctive and not unpleasant. Homey, you'd call it, if home is a felt tent in an Iron Age nomadic camp during an early winter cold snap. Outside, the day remains bright and frozen. The sun makes its low arc across the southern sky, providing light but minimal warmth, the angle of radiation too shallow to really heat anything. Shadows are long even at midday. stretching across the frost-stiffened grass. You notice that the Scythians aren't particularly bothered by the cold weather. This is just part of the yearly cycle, the expected arrival of winter, something to be managed but not feared. They have the clothing and the shelter and the stored food and the cultural knowledge to handle temperatures that would be genuinely dangerous to unprepared people. The felt architecture reveals its full sophistication in these conditions. The rounded shape sheds wind efficiently, offering minimal resistance to the gusts that would knock down less aerodynamic structures. The felt itself is weatherproof, shedding snow and ice, maintaining its insulating properties even when damp. The entire design is the result of centuries of refinement, each generation making small improvements, adapting the structure to perfectly match the requirements of mobile life in a climate with serious winters. Evening comes early, the sun setting well before you're psychologically ready for it, the short day feeling abbreviated and rushed. But darkness means everyone retreating inside, fires building up, the felt houses glowing warmly in the frozen night. The communal gathering is indoors tonight, everyone crowding into the largest dwelling, bodies packed together providing additional warmth. The atmosphere is festive despite, or perhaps because of, the cold outside. There's music again, the stringed instrument from before plus what sounds like a drum, creating rhythms that make people want to move. Someone starts dancing, or what passes for dancing in the constrained space. Rhythmic movements, coordinated swaying, the use of hands and shoulders since there's not enough room for full body movement. Others join in, and soon half the people in the dwelling are dancing while the other half watches and claps, the energy building despite the limited space. Children are delighted by the indoor celebration, joining the dancing with enthusiastic if not entirely rhythmic movements, creating chaos that the adults accommodate with patient amusement. One small kid crashes into an adult's legs, bounces off and continues dancing without missing a beat, completely unbothered by the collision. The music builds to some kind of crescendo. You're not familiar enough with the musical tradition to know if this is the actual end or just a dramatic pause, and then stops, leaving everyone slightly breathless and laughing. The dancers collapse into sitting positions, fanning themselves despite the fact that it's freezing outside, overheated from exertion in the warm interior. Someone passes around the fermented mare's milk drink, and everyone takes enthusiastic swigs, the alcohol adding to the general atmosphere of celebration. You take your turn when the bag reaches you. The sour taste familiar now, almost pleasant. The slight burn as it goes down, warming from the inside. The evening continues with more music, more stories, more of the social bonding that nomadic communities rely on to maintain cohesion through long winters and longer migrations. You're part of it now, no longer an observer, but a participant, included in the gathering without question or qualification. Late in the night, you've lost track of time, measured only in songs and stories. People begin drifting towards sleep. The dwelling will stay warm through the night. The fire kept going by whoever wakes up and notices it getting low. Everyone sleeps in the same space, packed together for warmth. Privacy sacrificed to practicality. You find a spot to lie down, surrounded by sleeping Scythians, listening to the sounds of people breathing and occasionally snoring, the fire crackling. The wind outside making the felt walls shift slightly. The stars are invisible from inside the dwelling, but you know they're there, the same stars that have watched over the steppe for millions of years before humans arrived, and will continue watching for millions more after humans are gone. You drift into sleep with the smell of smoke and wool and cooking, and humanity filling your lungs, warm and sheltered in mobile architecture that refuses to acknowledge winter as anything more than a temporary inconvenience. Tomorrow the cold might continue, or it might break, or it might get worse. The Scythians will adapt to whatever comes, moving if they need to, staying if they can, making decisions based on weather and animal welfare, and the accumulated wisdom of a culture that's been living mobile for longer than anyone can remember. But tonight, you're warm and fed and safe, surrounded by people who have made a home out of movement, who've turned impermanence into a perfectly functional form of architecture. The fire burns low, casting dancing shadows on the felt walls. Outside, the steppe sleeps under frost and stars, and inside, the Scythians rest, ready for whatever tomorrow brings. The archaeological dig site sits in northern Kazakhstan, and you're standing at its edge trying to reconcile the scientific precision of the excavation with the lived experience you've been observing. The year is now, modern times, decades into the 21st century. The frozen ground that preserved so much Scythian material has been carefully excavated, revealing a burial chamber that's been sealed for over 2,000 years. Archaeologists in modern cold weather gear work with brushes and small tools, documenting everything, photographing from multiple angles, treating each object like the irreplaceable historical artifact it is. The contrast is profound. You've been watching people live in felt houses, eating food prepared over dung fires, wearing clothes they made themselves from wool they processed by hand. Now you're watching those same objects, or objects exactly like them, being carefully removed from frozen soil and placed in climate-controlled containers for transport to museums and research facilities. A felt panel emerges from the excavation, remarkably preserved, the decorative pattern still clearly visible after millennia in the ground. The archaeologist handling it works with extraordinary care, supporting the fragile material, speaking into a voice recorder to document the find's exact position and condition. The felt looks essentially identical to what you saw being made a few days ago, or a few thousand years ago, depending on how you're measuring. The same geometric patterns, the same careful construction. Another researcher is working on what appears to be leather objects, possibly parts of riding equipment or clothing. The leather is dark with age but structurally intact, preserved by the particular chemistry of frozen burial that prevented decay. Each item gets photographed, measured, documented, wrapped and carefully stored. You watch a wooden object emerge, possibly part of a cartwheel or a structural element from a dwelling. The wood is stained dark but hasn't rotted, the grain still visible, the craftsmanship still apparent. Someone made this with hand tools and knowledge passed down through generations, shaped it to serve a specific purpose in a mobile life, and then it ended up buried here, waiting for modern archaeology to rediscover it. The burial chamber itself is an extraordinary feat of engineering. It was constructed below ground level, wooden walls and roof creating a stable space, then covered with earth and turf to create the kurgan you saw rising from the steppe. The engineering required to build something this substantial without modern equipment is impressive, requiring coordination and skill, and probably a fair amount of trial and error across many generations. Inside the chamber, you can see into it now, the excavation having removed enough soil to expose the interior, there are multiple bodies. The primary burial, probably a person of high status, is surrounded by what appear to be companions or servants, horses, and an astonishing amount of grave goods. Gold objects catch the light, their surfaces still bright after all this time underground. Textiles that should have rotted away have somehow survived, colours faded but patterns still visible. An archaeologist is gently brushing soil away from what looks like a human face, preserved by the frozen conditions into something that's still recognisably a person. The individual has been dead for over 2,000 years, but the preservation is remarkable. Skin, hair, even facial features still present, allowing modern science to study details that would normally be lost within days of death. It's deeply strange to see someone's actual face from the Scythian period, to look at a person who lived the mobile life you've been observing, who knew how to fold and unfold felt houses, who could ride a horse at full gallop while shooting arrows, who understood the steppe in ways you never will. The excavation continues methodically. Every object gets catalogued, every position documented, the entire process designed to extract maximum information while minimizing damage to the fragile materials. This is archaeology at its most careful, the recognition that each kurgan is an irreplaceable time capsule that will never be exactly replicated. A researcher approaches you, or rather, approaches the observation point where you're standing, since you're not actually physically present in any way that would make sense to modern archaeologists. She's young, probably a graduate student, wearing layers of technical outdoor clothing that would seem like magic to the Scythians. She's carrying a tablet computer, swiping through images of artifacts, comparing what's being found to known examples from other sites. She's trying to understand the Scythians through objects, building a picture of their culture from material remains. It's good work, important work, the only way modern people can access cultures that left no written records. But it's also fundamentally limited, trying to reconstruct lived experience from the things that survived burial, rather than from the things that mattered in daily life. The felt houses that defined Scythian architecture won't appear much in the archaeological record. They were made from organic materials that decay, and they were used until they wore out rather than being discarded in preserved contexts. The mobile architecture that was central to Scythian life is mostly invisible to archaeology, detectable only through occasional preserved examples, or through inference from other evidence. What survives is the spectacular, the gold, the preserved textiles from elite burials, the horses sacrificed to accompany their owners. The everyday, the mundane, the actual experience of living nomadically, that's much harder to reconstruct from material remains. You watch the excavation and think about what's being lost in the translation, from lived culture to archaeological artifact. The smell of horses and felt and cooking, the sound of grass moving in wind, the feeling of packing up a felt house and knowing you could set it up again anywhere on the steppe, the social dynamics of a community that lives in constant proximity, the jokes and tensions and relationships that don't survive as grave goods. The researchers doing excellent work extracting every possible piece of information from the physical remains. But they're working with fragments, trying to understand a whole culture from the small percentage of it that happened to be buried in ways that allowed preservation. A particularly beautiful gold object emerges from the excavation, a plaque showing a stylized animal in the distinctive Scythian style, dynamic and flowing, full of movement even in static metal. The archaeologist handling it gasps slightly, recognizing the quality of the craftsmanship. This is museum-quality material, the kind of artifact that will end up in exhibitions, that will become one of the iconic objects representing Scythian culture. But you remember watching the goldsmith who might have made this, or someone exactly like them, working with patience and skill, heating metal over a fire, hammering it into shape, creating art that served both decorative and possibly spiritual functions. The object in the archaeologist's hands is the same physical thing, but it exists in a completely different context now, transformed from functional object into historical artifact. The day progresses, the excavation revealing more of the burial chamber's contents. There are weapons, bows and arrows, swords, daggers, all showing the sophisticated metalworking that the Scythians achieved. There are ceramics, some local production, some imported from Greek colonies on the Black Sea, evidence of the trade networks that connected the mobile Scythians to settled civilizations. There are textiles that make the researchers extremely excited, rare survivals that will provide information about weaving techniques, dye sources, fashion preferences. Each piece is a small window into daily life, though windows that show only fragments of a much larger picture. The human remains are being treated with particular care and respect. Modern archaeology tries to balance scientific inquiry with respect for the dead, recognizing that these were real people whose graves are being disturbed in the name of knowledge. The researchers work seriously, quietly, aware of the ethical complexity of what they're doing. As the excavation continues, you think about the Scythians you've been watching, how they would react to knowing that thousands of years after their deaths, people would be carefully digging up their graves and removing everything to study in laboratories and display in museums. They buried their dead with grave goods because they believed those objects would be useful in some kind of afterlife, not because they wanted to provide information to future archaeologists. The sun begins to set and the excavation team starts preparing to secure the site for the night. Tarps get stretched over the exposed chamber to protect it from weather. Equipment gets packed away. Documentation gets backed up to multiple digital locations in case of technical failures. The kurgan sits in the landscape looking much as it did before the excavation began, though now with a large hole exposing its interior. Tomorrow the work will continue. More objects will be carefully removed, more documentation will accumulate. Eventually the excavation will be complete, the chamber fully emptied, the findings published in academic journals and displayed in museums, and somewhere, invisibly, the Scythians continue their existence in historical memory, transformed from living people into cultural artifacts, their mobile architecture and seasonal migrations reduced to a few paragraphs in history books and collections of objects in glass cases. You look at the excavation site, then back across the steppe where the grass moves in its endless waves, where the horizon stretches impossibly far, where the sky dominates everything. The landscape the Scythians knew is still here, essentially unchanged, still vast and open and indifferent to human concerns. The felt houses are gone, the seasonal migrations ended, the mobile civilization dissolved back into the steppe it came from, but the grass still grows, the wind still blows, the stars still wheel overhead in the same patterns that guided Scythian navigation. What's left is fragments and memories, archaeological evidence and historical speculation, attempts to reconstruct a way of life that refused to leave permanent traces. The Scythians built in movement rather than stone, in seasonal cycles rather than fixed monuments, in knowledge passed orally rather than written records, and then they vanished, absorbed into other cultures, changed by invasions and migrations and the slow transformation of the steppe world. The mobile architecture stopped being built. The felt houses were replaced by permanent structures. The vast territories that once belonged to horseback nomads became divided into nations with fixed borders. But for 1,000 years the Scythians rode across the Eurasian steppe, carrying their homes with them, creating a civilization that moved. And in the frozen ground, in the carefully excavated kurgans, in the preserved textiles and gold objects and human remains, fragments of that world survive, waiting to tell their incomplete stories to anyone patient enough to listen. The excavation site darkens as the sun sets. The researchers head back to their modern accommodations, leaving the ancient burial under its protective tarps. And the steppe settles into night, vast and dark and full of ghosts that archaeology can only partially reveal. The architecture of movement has become the archaeology of stillness, and you stand between them, watching time collapse into a single moment where past and present exist simultaneously, where the Scythians are both gone and somehow still here, riding invisible horses across grass that remembers everything and reveals almost nothing. Welcome to medieval Europe, where life unfolds slowly across seasons and generations. You're settling into a time when most people live their entire lives within a day's walk of where they were born, and rumours travel faster than certainty ever could. Power exists somewhere distant, operating through systems most will never fully see. You wake before dawn because that's simply what people do. The rhythm hasn't changed in living memory. Your grandfather woke this early, and his grandfather before him. Light comes gradually through shuttered windows, and you dress in layers that smell faintly of wood smoke and wear. Outside, the village looks much as it did yesterday. Thatched roofs sit heavy with morning dampness. Chickens peck near doorways. Someone's already started a fire, and thin smoke rises straight up in the still air. You can hear a cow lowing from the common pasture and the soft clatter of a wooden bucket against stone. Most of your day involves repetition. You tend animals or work the strips of land your family has farmed for generations. Your hands know the feel of rope, dirt, grain, and wood better than anything else. The work follows patterns set by the season and the weather, not by choice or innovation. The church bell rings at intervals, marking the hours of prayer, even if you can't always stop to observe them properly. The sound carries across fields and reminds you that time continues, measured and steady. You know the priest keeps records somewhere, written on parchment you've never touched, in letters you wouldn't recognise. Trade happens in the village square on market days. People bring eggs, cloth, vegetables, or tools. Coins change hands sometimes, but more often you exchange goods directly. A length of rope for 3 loaves of bread, wool for candles. The transactions happen face to face, with neighbours you've known since childhood. Authority exists, but at a distance. The lord who owns much of this land lives in a manor house you've passed but never entered. His steward comes through periodically to collect taxes or settle disputes. You pay what's owed in grain or labour, recorded in a ledger you'll never see. The system operates above your daily concerns. News arrives slowly and often second-hand. A traveller mentions something happening 2 valleys over. A merchant repeats a story heard at another market. You file these fragments away without much ability to verify them. Geography limits knowledge just as much as literacy does. Your children help with chores as soon as they're able. They learn by watching and doing, not through formal instruction. The oldest remembers to check the hen house. The youngest carries water from the well. These tasks will define their days just as similar tasks defined yours. Nearby, a monastery operates on its own schedule. Monks rise even earlier than you do, their days structured around prayer and work. They copy manuscripts, tend gardens, and maintain the only library for many miles. You know they possess knowledge, but it remains largely separate from your daily needs. The village itself rarely changes. Houses stand where they've stood for decades. Paths follow the same routes between homes, fields, and common areas. When something does shift, like a new family moving in, or an old building needing repair, it becomes a topic of conversation for weeks. You eat porridge in the morning and bread with whatever else is available later in the day. Meals depend entirely on the season and the harvest. In winter, you rely on stored grain and preserved vegetables. In summer, there's more variety, but also more work required to prepare for the next winter. The rhythm continues regardless of what might be happening elsewhere. Kings could be plotting, bishops could be scheming, but here the cows still need milking, and the grain still needs grinding. Your world operates on a scale measured in footsteps and familiar faces. Records exist in quantities most people never imagine. Scribes sit in dim rooms throughout the realm, copying agreements, lists, and correspondence. Their handwriting fills parchment page after parchment page, creating an archive of obligations and arrangements. These documents travel in leather cases, carried by messengers who know specific routes between manors, monasteries, and administrative centres. A letter might take weeks to reach its destination, following roads that turn to mud in spring and freeze solid in winter. The messenger memorises the route and carries the seal that proves authenticity. Seals matter enormously. Wax impressed with a signet ring transforms a piece of parchment into something official. The mark represents authority in physical form. Clerks verify these impressions carefully, checking the design against known examples. A forged seal means a forged document, and the consequences follow accordingly. Oaths bind people together across distances. A vassal swears loyalty to a lord in a ceremony witnessed by others. The words get recorded. The relationship becomes formal and documented. These verbal agreements, once written down, create networks of obligation that extend across entire regions. You're connected to this system even if you never see most of it. The grain you harvest gets tallied. The labour you provide gets noted. Somewhere, in a ledger kept by someone you've never met, your contributions appear as lines of text. The administration operates quietly and continuously. Monasteries function as information centres. Monks correspond with other monasteries, sharing news and documents. They maintain copies of important texts and legal precedents. When disputes arise, these records provide evidence that can settle questions about land ownership or historical agreements. Some information travels through official channels only. A king issues a decree that gets copied and distributed to regional authorities. Each copy carries the royal seal. Local officials read these documents aloud in public spaces, translating policy into something the population can hear and theoretically understand. But other information moves through informal networks. A bishop's secretary mentions something to a travelling merchant. That merchant repeats the story at an inn. Someone overhearing it carries the tale to another town. By the time the information circles back, it may have changed considerably, but it still circulates. Meetings happen behind closed doors. Lords and bishops and administrators gather in private chambers to discuss matters that will eventually affect thousands of people. These conversations leave no records in the moment, though their outcomes often do. A new tax appears, a marriage alliance forms, territory changes hands. Clerks develop shorthand systems that let them record discussions quickly. They take notes during meetings, then expand them into proper documents later. This process introduces small opportunities for adjustment or interpretation, where emphasis can shift slightly without anyone noticing immediately. Messages sometimes travel in code. A sender and recipient agree on substitutions for sensitive words. Names become numbers. Locations get described indirectly. The letter appears innocent if intercepted, but means something quite specific to the intended reader. This practice exists alongside open correspondence, adding layers to written communication. Physical access controls information too. Certain rooms require permission to enter. Specific chests remain locked, their keys held by trusted individuals. Documents stay in designated locations, consulted only when necessary and under supervision. The architecture of information storage creates natural barriers. Trust gets distributed carefully. A lord relies on a steward to manage daily affairs. The steward trusts certain clerks with sensitive tasks. Those clerks work with scribes who copy documents without necessarily understanding their full meaning. Each level knows what it needs to know and rarely more. Sometimes arrangements remain deliberately vague. Two parties agree to cooperate without specifying exact terms in writing. This flexibility allows adaptation, but also creates space for disagreement later. When disputes arise, witnesses must recall conversations that happened months or years earlier, with memory serving as the only record. The system functions through repetition and routine. The same messengers follow the same routes. The same clerks perform the same tasks. Annual cycles of tax collection, legal reviews, and administrative reporting create predictable patterns. Within this regularity, variations can easily go unnoticed until much later. Stories circulate constantly through medieval communities. You hear them at the well, in the market, after church, and while working side by side in the fields. Most begin with someone claiming to have heard something from someone else, who supposedly witnessed or learned about an event. A typical rumour might sound simple at first. Someone mentions that a neighbouring lord seems to be hiring more guards than usual. This observation passes from person to person, each retelling adding small details or interpretations. By the time the story reaches you, it might include speculation about why the guards are needed, or what they might be protecting. Repetition gives these stories weight. When you hear the same tale from 3 different sources, it begins to feel reliable even without direct evidence. The human mind naturally seeks patterns and connections, so separate fragments of information start forming into coherent narratives whether or not they actually belong together. Markets serve as major exchange points for news. Merchants arriving from different directions bring stories from their travels. These accounts get shared while transactions happen, spreading to everyone within earshot. A piece of gossip from one town mixes with unrelated news from another, creating hybrid stories that take on lives of their own. Religious spaces generate their own information networks. People gather for services, pilgrimages, and feast days. During these events, conversation flows naturally. Someone mentions seeing unusual activity near a monastery. Another person recalls hearing about a bishop making unexpected visits. These fragments get woven together through casual discussion. Literacy remains rare enough that written information feels inherently more authoritative. If someone claims to have seen a document or heard a letter read aloud, their account carries extra credibility. Most listeners can't verify the contents themselves, so they accept the description at face value. Seasonal rhythms affect how stories spread. During harvest, people work long hours with less time for extended conversation. In winter, when darkness comes early and outdoor work diminishes, there's more opportunity to sit together and share tales. Some rumours circulate slowly for months before reaching certain communities. Travellers always attract attention and questions. A pilgrim passing through gets asked about conditions on the road and news from other regions. Their answers get remembered and repeated, even if the traveller themselves was just passing along rumours they heard elsewhere. Information chains extend across vast distances this way. Misunderstandings happen constantly. Someone overhears part of a conversation and fills in the missing pieces incorrectly. A gesture or expression gets misinterpreted. A name gets confused with a similar name. These small errors compound as stories pass from person to person, sometimes creating entirely new versions of events. Timing matters in unpredictable ways. A rumour that circulates while nothing else significant is happening gets more attention and elaboration. The same story introduced during a busy period might get mentioned briefly and forgotten. The information environment constantly shifts based on competing demands for attention. People naturally want to contribute something new to conversations. This desire leads to embellishment and creative additions. Someone repeats a story but adds a detail that makes it more interesting or relevant to local concerns. The next person includes that detail and adds their own. The original information gradually transforms. Certain individuals become known as reliable sources. A merchant who travels regularly might be considered trustworthy about trade routes and regional politics. A former soldier might be asked about military matters. These reputations mean their versions of stories carry more weight, even when they're speculating just like everyone else. Shared suspicion sometimes emerges without any particular evidence. If enough people express vague concerns about something, those concerns start feeling justified simply through repetition. A general unease about a powerful family or institution can persist for years, supported more by accumulated whispers than by specific grievances. Written records rarely exist to contradict popular narratives. Most events leave no documentation accessible to ordinary people. Without the ability to check facts against official accounts, stories perpetuate based purely on their internal consistency and how well they fit existing beliefs about how power operates. Some rumours prove impossible to fully disprove. They involve events that supposedly happened in private or in distant locations. No one can definitively say they didn't occur, so they linger in the collective memory. Decades later, people still mention them as possibilities, keeping the stories alive across generations. Sleep follows the sun's schedule more than personal preference. You go to bed when darkness makes work difficult and rise when light returns. This pattern shifts gradually across seasons, expanding and contracting with the available daylight, but always maintaining its basic rhythm. Your sleeping space is shared, often with family members, and sometimes with animals whose body heat helps ward off cold. Straw mattresses rest on simple wooden frames or directly on packed earth floors. Blankets made from wool provide warmth, layered according to the season's demands. Evening routines begin well before full darkness. Fires get banked to last through the night, providing dim light and residual warmth. Shutters close against wind and weather. Small tasks get completed, putting tools and materials in their proper places. Order matters when you'll need to find things again in morning dimness. The transition to sleep happens gradually. You might sit near the fire for a while after the day's work ends, mending something or simply resting. Conversation, if it happens, tends toward practical matters rather than elaborate storytelling. Energy conservation becomes natural when physical labour defines most waking hours. Dreams occur but rarely get discussed in detail. People mention sleeping well or poorly, but extensive dream interpretation belongs more to scholars and religious figures than to everyday life. Your mind processes the day's experiences while you sleep, but morning brings focus back to immediate tasks. Children fall asleep where they sit sometimes, exhausted from helping with chores or playing outside. They get carried to bed, barely stirring. Their sleep is deep and complete, the kind that comes from bodies still growing and minds not yet burdened with complex worries. Night sounds become familiar. Wind against thatch, animals settling, the occasional creak of wood adjusting to temperature changes. These noises don't disturb sleep because they're expected and normal. Your ears have learned what belongs and what might signal something requiring attention. Seasonal changes affect rest patterns noticeably. Summer nights stay warm enough that heavy coverings aren't needed. Winter requires careful preparation, with all available blankets piled on and bodies pressed close together for warmth. Spring and autumn bring variability, requiring adjustment from night to night. Religious hours continue even in darkness. Monastery bells ring for midnight prayers, though most people sleep through them. The dedicated few who wake for these observances do so out of commitment to spiritual discipline rather than social obligation. Their vigils happen privately while others rest undisturbed. Recovery happens during sleep. Muscles that worked hard during the day repair themselves. Minor aches and strains diminish. The body's natural healing processes operate most effectively during these hours of stillness. You wake feeling ready for another day, not because sleep eliminates all fatigue, but because the rhythm allows for basic restoration. Elderly members of the household often wake earlier and more frequently during the night. They move carefully in darkness, perhaps adding wood to the fire or simply adjusting their position to ease discomfort. These small disturbances rarely wake others who've adapted to the sounds of shared sleeping spaces. Rain on the roof creates a steady background noise that some find soothing. It signals that morning work might begin later or take different forms, allowing for slight variations in the usual routine. The sound of water becomes associated with permission to rest a bit longer. Illness disrupts normal sleep patterns. Someone coughing or feverish requires attention and care. Others in the household adjust, sleeping lighter or taking turns providing comfort. These periods pass, and the household returns to its regular rhythm, though everyone remembers who helped during difficult nights. Morning arrives gradually. Light seeps in through gaps around shutters. Birds begin their calls. Someone rises first, stirring the fire and starting preparations for the day. Others wake one by one, emerging from sleep without alarm or urgency, simply responding to the natural signals that night has ended. The cycle repeats with remarkable consistency. Variations occur due to weather, health, or unusual circumstances, but the fundamental pattern remains stable. This regularity provides psychological comfort, creating a framework within which life feels predictable and manageable, despite uncertainties in other areas. Grain defines wealth in ways that go beyond simple sustenance. The amount of wheat, barley or rye a household stores determines its stability through winter and its ability to manage unexpected difficulties. These stores accumulate slowly through successful harvests and deplete steadily through consumption and obligations. Land ownership concentrates in relatively few hands. Most people farm fields they don't technically own, paying rent through labour or a portion of their harvest. The arrangement continues year after year, maintained by tradition and documented agreements that favour those who already hold power. Mills process grain into flour, but operating a mill requires authorization and often comes with fees. You bring your grain to the designated mill and pay a percentage for the service. The miller grows prosperous through countless small transactions, accumulating wealth from the steady stream of people who have no alternative. Salt preservation extends the life of meat and fish, making it valuable beyond its taste-enhancing properties. Control over salt sources means control over food security. Trade routes carrying salt connect distant regions, and whoever manages these routes gains significant influence. Tax collection happens through various mechanisms. Officials count livestock, measure stored grain, and assess property values. These evaluations determine what each household owes, payable in goods or labour. The system extracts resources from the many to support the few, maintained through careful record keeping. Feast days and religious obligations require food contributions. Households set aside portions of their production for church tithes and local celebrations. These commitments reduce what remains for personal use but create social cohesion and demonstrate participation in community life. Crop failures affect entire regions simultaneously. When weather prevents successful harvest, everyone faces shortage together. Stored reserves from previous years become critical. Those with deeper reserves can weather the difficulty better, sometimes purchasing additional supplies from those forced to sell at disadvantageous terms. Forest access provides supplementary resources beyond farming. Wood for fuel and construction, game for meat, and mushrooms and berries for food variation. Rights to use forest land get controlled and allocated, with permissions granted or restricted based on social position and formal agreements. Water sources require maintenance and management. Wells need cleaning, irrigation channels need clearing, and mills need flowing water to operate. Communities organise labour to maintain these essential resources, with costs and benefits distributed according to established patterns. Trade goods move along established routes that rarely change. Certain towns become known for specific products like wool, pottery or metalwork. Merchants follow these routes regularly, creating networks where goods, money and information all flow together in predictable patterns. Debt relationships bind people across years. Someone borrows grain for planting and owes repayment after harvest, plus interest. These obligations get recorded and enforced, creating ongoing connections between lenders and borrowers that extend beyond single transactions. Livestock represents mobile wealth. Animals can be traded, sold, or used as payment. They reproduce, potentially increasing value over time. Caring for them requires constant effort, but they provide insurance against crop failure and serve multiple practical purposes. Storage facilities matter enormously. A well-built granary protects harvest from moisture and vermin. Poor storage means loss through spoilage. Investment in proper storage infrastructure pays returns every season, protecting accumulated wealth from degradation. Labour itself becomes a resource to be allocated. During harvest, everyone capable helps in the fields. At other times, labour gets directed toward maintenance, construction, or specialised tasks. Controlling how labour gets used means controlling what gets accomplished and who benefits. Markets operate on regular schedules, creating concentrated moments of exchange. Prices fluctuate based on availability, season, and competition. Experienced traders develop an understanding of these patterns, buying when prices drop and selling when they rise, accumulating advantage through many small transactions. Candles and oil lamps provide light after sunset in homes that can afford them. The flame stays small to conserve fuel, creating a circle of illumination surrounded by darkness. Work continues in this limited light, but it shifts to tasks that don't require broad vision or physical space. Scribes spend evening hours copying manuscripts. Their posture hunches over desks, quills moving steadily across parchment. Each letter takes shape deliberately, following practiced forms that ensure legibility. The work demands concentration but becomes meditative through repetition. Account books get reviewed by candlelight. Numbers representing transactions, inventories, and obligations fill columns on the page. Clerks verify totals, compare entries, and note discrepancies. This quiet work maintains the records that make administration possible. Reading happens in monasteries and noble households where books exist. Texts get shared among those with literacy and read aloud sometimes so others can hear. Religious works predominate, but historical chronicles and classical writings circulate too, preserved through careful copying. Learning to read requires years of instruction. Students practice letters repeatedly, forming them correctly before moving to words and sentences. The skill remains specialised, marking someone as educated and creating opportunities unavailable to those who never gain literacy. Maps exist but remain rare and often inaccurate. Cartographers combine travellers' accounts, estimated distances, and known landmarks to create representations of territory. These documents get consulted when planning routes or understanding political boundaries, though most people navigate by memory and local knowledge. Letters written in evening quiet carry news and instructions across distances. The writer chooses words carefully, knowing the message will be read by specific eyes in specific circumstances. Privacy depends on trust in the messenger and the seal's integrity. Almanacs track agricultural and religious calendars, providing reference for planning. They note optimal planting times, saints' feast days, and astronomical events. These compilations represent accumulated knowledge passed down and updated across generations. Music exists primarily through memory and practice. Songs get learned by ear and passed along verbally. No system for recording melodies in writing has widespread use yet, so musical tradition depends entirely on continuous transmission from performer to performer. Textile work continues indoors during evening hours. Spinning, weaving, mending, and embroidery all suit limited light conditions. Hands know the motions well enough that vision serves mainly to verify quality rather than guide every movement. Recipes and craft techniques stay largely unwritten. A master brewer or cheesemaker passes knowledge to apprentices through demonstration and verbal instruction. The exact measurements and timing become internalized through repeated practice, rather than consultation of written formulas. Family histories exist as oral traditions in most households. Grandparents tell children about ancestors, preserving names, relationships, and significant events through storytelling. These accounts shape identity and maintain connections across generations despite a lack of written genealogies. Legal precedents get remembered by those who administer justice. A lord or his representatives recall similar cases from the past when making decisions about disputes. This institutional memory operates through people rather than comprehensive written codes. Prayer happens privately in evening hours for those inclined toward personal devotion. The words might follow established forms learned in church, or become more spontaneous expressions of individual concerns and gratitude. These quiet moments of reflection punctuate the day's end. Observations about weather, crops, and animals get shared in casual evening conversation. Someone mentions that frost came unusually early this year. Another notes that certain birds haven't migrated when expected. These details accumulate into practical knowledge about local conditions. Darkness settles over communities with predictable completeness. Artificial light remains expensive enough that most extinguish flames soon after necessary tasks finish. The night becomes a time of stillness rather than continued activity. Guards maintain watch in certain locations. Castle walls, monastery gates, and wealthy households employ people to stay alert through dark hours. These watchmen follow established routes, checking doors and listening for unusual sounds. Their presence provides security without drama or incident most nights. Church bells mark hours even in darkness. The sound carries across sleeping towns, maintaining temporal structure throughout the night. Those awake for any reason can orient themselves in time through these regular signals. Animals settle into their own routines. Chickens roost silently. Cows and sheep rest in barns or pens. Guard dogs remain alert but quiet unless something genuinely unusual occurs. The animal world adjusts to nighttime just as the human one does. Street activity ceases almost entirely in most places. A few major cities maintain some nighttime commerce and movement, but villages and small towns empty after dark. Walking through streets at night happens rarely and usually for specific purposes, like fetching help during an emergency. Fire safety requires attention before sleep. Embers get arranged carefully, provided with fuel that will burn slowly without sending sparks beyond the hearth. The risk of uncontrolled fire motivates careful evening procedures that become second nature. Temperature drops as night progresses, especially in colder months. Buildings retain some warmth from daytime fires, but eventually the chill penetrates. People burrow deeper into bedding, sometimes waking briefly to adjust coverings before drifting back to sleep. Moon phases affect nighttime visibility significantly. A full moon allows limited navigation and work if necessary. New moons bring near-total darkness that makes movement difficult and potentially dangerous. The cycle creates predictable variation in nighttime conditions. Starlight provides orientation for those who know the sky. Familiar constellations mark seasons and directions. Travellers study these patterns, learning to use them when clouds don't obscure the view. This knowledge passes between generations as practical information. Silence isn't absolute. Wind moves through trees and across fields. Water flows in streams and rivers. Owls hunt and call. The night has its own soundscape, different from day but no less natural. These sounds blend into background awareness for those accustomed to them. Illness or injury sometimes requires nighttime attention. Someone rises to tend a sick child or address sudden pain. These disruptions happen by necessity rather than choice, managed quietly to avoid disturbing others more than required. Dreams fill the sleeping mind with images and scenarios that feel vivid in the moment. Upon waking, most fade quickly, leaving only vague impressions. Occasionally a dream lingers, puzzling or pleasant, carried into morning consciousness. Security comes through familiar routine rather than elaborate precautions. Doors close with simple latches. Valuables, if any exist, stay in known locations. The expectation that night will be like other nights creates calm acceptance rather than anxious vigilance. Morning preparation begins before full light. The first person awake rekindles the fire, coaxing flames from preserved embers. This task marks the transition from night to day, resuming activity after hours of rest. The cycle continues regardless of individual circumstance. Whether someone sleeps well or poorly, whether the night brings storm or stillness, morning follows darkness with reliable certainty. This dependability anchors daily life in patterns larger than any single person's experience. Centuries later, researchers examine medieval records with careful attention. Parchment documents preserved in archives reveal arrangements that contemporary people suspected but couldn't prove. The written evidence confirms that certain families did indeed make secret agreements, that some officials did manipulate records for personal gain, and that power operated through hidden channels alongside visible ones. Archaeological evidence supports some of the old stories. Excavations uncover hidden chambers, concealed passages, and buried caches that match descriptions passed down through generations. What seemed like legend occasionally turns out to have a physical foundation, validated through scientific examination. Scholarly analysis of medieval financial records exposes sophisticated manipulation techniques. Clerks did alter account books to hide theft or redirect funds. The methods varied in complexity, but the fundamental pattern appears repeatedly across different regions and time periods. Some conspiracies were exactly what people whispered about. Land ownership disputes that seemed settled during the medieval period get reassessed through modern legal history research. Forged documents that granted property rights receive scrutiny. In several documented cases, powerful families did use fraudulent charters to claim land that rightfully belonged to others, exactly as contemporary rumours suggested. Political marriages arranged in secret become visible through correspondence that survived in monastery archives. Letters reveal negotiations that occurred privately, with public announcements only after agreements were finalised. The matchmaking that people speculated about in markets and fields did happen behind closed doors. Church investigations from the medieval period, recorded in ecclesiastical archives, document misconduct that people discussed in whispers. Some religious figures did abuse their positions. Some institutions did prioritise wealth accumulation over spiritual mission. The concerns that circulated as gossip had a basis in documented reality. Military campaigns that seemed poorly planned or strangely executed receive new interpretation when historians discover correspondence between supposed enemies. A few medieval conflicts did involve secret cooperation between combatants, with public hostilities masking private agreements about how to divide territory or resources. Poisoning cases that generated rumours about noble households sometimes find confirmation in medical examination of preserved remains. Modern forensic analysis detects toxic substances in bones and tissue, validating suspicions that certain deaths weren't natural. The quiet concerns people expressed had a foundation in hidden violence. Trade monopolies that seemed suspiciously strong get explained through the discovery of secret agreements between merchants and authorities. Written contracts show that some traders did pay officials for exclusive rights, exactly as competitors suspected. The economic arrangements that felt unfair often were precisely that. Despite these revelations about concealed power and hidden manipulation, daily life for most medieval people continued in familiar patterns. Crops still needed planting regardless of political scheming. Animals required care whether or not distant authorities were plotting. The fundamental rhythms of survival and work persisted. Modern understanding of medieval conspiracies doesn't dramatically change the basic historical narrative. Yes, some powerful people conspired. Yes, some institutions operated corruptly. But these discoveries mostly confirm what many people at the time already suspected. The surprises come mainly in specific details rather than overall patterns. What remains most striking in reviewing medieval life isn't the conspiracies themselves, but rather how little they affected everyday routines for ordinary people. Life happened in fields, workshops, and homes, shaped more by weather and season than by secret agreements made in distant manor houses or church councils. The records that prove medieval conspiracies true also show extensive documentation of normal administration. For every forged charter, hundreds of legitimate ones exist. For every corrupt official, many others performed their duties honestly. The systems functioned imperfectly, but continuously. Modern historians note that while some conspiracies existed and operated successfully for years or decades, they eventually left evidence. The human impulse to document, to write things down, and to create records ultimately reveals what was meant to stay hidden. Secrets kept through spoken agreement can vanish, but written evidence persists. You can imagine yourself in that medieval landscape now, knowing what's known today. The routines continue. Bread gets baked. Fields get worked. Children grow. Behind these activities, power operates in ways not always visible or fair. But life itself, immediate, physical, demanding, requires attention regardless of what might be happening elsewhere. Evening comes again, as it has for countless generations. Light fades, work stops. People settle into rest. Whatever schemes exist in distant courts or monasteries, whatever arrangements powerful figures have made in secret, the night still brings its familiar quiet. Sleep still restores. Morning still comes. The pattern continues, steady and remarkably resilient, carrying forward through seasons and centuries, exactly as it always has.